All right, I think we have everybody, right? And it's 6 o'clock and we are live. So I will call to meeting the policy committee meeting of March 1st at 6 o'clock. Hello, everybody. It's been a long time. No see. It's actually good because it keeps it fresh in my mind in terms of the policies, because I think we had a lot of questions outstanding, right? So, and we have a pretty aggressive agenda tonight. So I'm not confident that we're going to get through everything. If we do, that's great. But also, I think we should spend the time on, especially some of these ones that came up from our last meeting, spend the time to make sure we go through them and make sure any of our questions are answered. And even if that ends up taking an inordinate amount of our meeting today. So with that being said, I think that where we were, the first one on our agenda is policy 1700, otherwise lawful possession of firearms on school property. We did discuss this a week ago at our last committee meeting. We decided to have it come back to us. Our feedback at that point, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll try to summarize. At that meeting, we decided to use a Shipman and Goodwin policy model as our template, which was different than what we had as our RPS policy in the past. We did not want to use the language for the optional exceptions that was in that policy. I think there were quite a few options. We decided not to do that. We had some follow-up questions regarding definitions of deadly weapons, which we'll get to in a minute. I think specifically Ken had asked, what about tasers and stun guns and other things like that? We'll talk about that in a second. And then I believe Joe had asked, can we remove section 4, which is the other exceptions? So, Susie, I think you mentioned that we'd gotten some feedback from Shipman and Goodwin a short time ago about.
Yes, we did late this afternoon, and I haven't actually had the opportunity to digest it fully, but I'll share out what our attorney has shared with us. Just keep in mind, I actually emailed her late last week asking the question, so she didn't have much turnaround time. But with respect to the first question that we asked is whether or not we could remove all, in section 4, all other exceptions. Then we also asked, can stun guns and tasers, should those be included in the definition of deadly weapons? And a legal's response was basically that section 4 tracks the legal exceptions to the criminal offense of possession of a weapon of school grounds. And then essentially she's, our attorney pasted the statute. So it's, section 53A 217B, which I believe is in is referred to on page 2 of the policy from Shipman, is essentially a person is guilty of a possession of a weapon on school grounds when, knowing that such person is not licensed or privileged to do so, such person possesses a firearm or deadly weapon as defined in section 53A-3. 1, in or on the real property comprising of a public or private elementary or secondary school, or 2, at a school-sponsored activity as defined in subsection H of section 10-233. So additionally, she just goes on to talk about the provisions, which we have as well. And then with respect to definition of a deadly weapon is also defined by statute. In that, which is statutes 53A-3, a deadly weapon means any weapon, whether loaded or unloaded, from which a shot may be discharged, or switchable knife, gravity knife, billy, blackjack, bludgeon, or metal knuckles. The definition of deadly weapon in this subdivision shall be deemed not to apply to section 2938 or 53206. So with respect to the question that I think came from the committee around stun guns, tasers, basically the way that I'm reading what she is saying is that whether it's loaded or unloaded from which a shot may be discharged, knives, blackjacks, bludgeon, or metal knuckles. So I'm not sure that the taser would be included in that. Perhaps the stun gun. I'm not really clear.
I did, after, we had some of those questions I did read on the last page of the model policy on page 4 that, bolded type underneath that says note, and it says under state law. And basically that paragraph says, we have to at least have a policy that addresses what those deadly weapons as defined by statute, but it does say we can go further if we want to in terms of prohibiting additional items, but it just says we can do that, but we just want to make sure that if we add some of those prohibited weapons into that we can practically enforce the prohibition. And the definitions used to describe other types of weapons. So it does seem like there is the option to add some in if they're not covered under that statutory language, but we have to make sure that we can.
So then my only question was, when you start to list, are there weapons that are not, that we just may miss? Right?
Yeah, that's possible.
And then it just thought about it too, like what about things like mace and pepper spray, which when many years ago when I was a little younger, I think just about every female that I knew had a little keychain with pepper spray or mace. These were my friends, not just acquaintances. These are people that I knew. So I don't know if that's even, do kids do that anymore? I mean, is that prevalent enough to worry about? Because I don't know that we would want everybody in school, the schools to be walking around with mace or pepper spray.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe I'm wondering is the exception to that it's not deadly.
Right. That's what I was just thinking. I mean, tasers and stun guns do have the potential of being deadly. It gives the person, could have a heart condition or something that they're firing it at.
Ken, you're on mute.
Of course. But then, like pepper spray, if you have an allergic reaction to pepper spray, I mean, yes, yeah. that can be fatal. And, and metal knuckles or bludgeon,
Ken, I think we lost you again. Could anyone else hear him?
No.
We're going to have to get him something to type it.
But what's great about Ken is that you can always feel his expression because he uses his hands to speak.
Ken, you want to try that again?
Nah, it's me rambling. No, I was just saying like metal knuckles aren't inherently deadly, but if you get hit hard enough or enough times, then they can be. But by the same time, so could a chair, for that matter.
So I guess
or stapling.
Someone brought up the good point, which is, and I think we've run into this before with policies, is that if we start to list each item that might be, then it's almost by omission. If we don't have something and that comes up, then we're like, oh, well, they omitted that. So that is, okay, versus a wider swath of omitted things. I mean, the metal knuckles, I guess the difference is because the statute specifically talks about that. So if we keep it with what the statute specifically talks about, and that might be why they say, you can make it broader, but if you do, make sure you consult with your attorneys before you add on a list, because it could have some of those.
So what is, Dr. De Silva, so what would the current policy be if a kid showed up at high school with a stun gun or a taser? What is our current policy? Like how would we address that?
So that's a weapon. So a student, we would call onto our school resource officer and or police. There would be disciplinary action. Really any type of weapon on school property would be problematic on a practical level.
Right. Yeah. So how is that covered by this policy or a separate policy?
It's covered by our discipline policy.
Okay.
And by the way, that could be a child at an elementary school who brings in their grandpa's.
Yeah, exactly.
Which happens.
Yeah, no, yeah, I've heard.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't really know
Even
what they have necessarily. Where a high school person, there may be some.
But it happens, or a facsimile of, Ken. So discipline policies also include facsimiles of. So this is a, you know, a toy gun, let's just say.
So should we keep it as it is with just the legal definition of some of those weapons then? Or specifically add it? Go ahead, Ken.
I'm just saying I'm okay as long as we have. What the point I wanted to get is we do have a policy that addresses those situations, and that's so I'm good.
All right, thank you. I think that's a good question. Okay. All right, so then back to the other question at hand, which was about the carving out of the exceptions. So as I read the attorney's note, it basically says this is the exception because of the consequence, right? So, and it being called a Class D felony.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that what I'm trying to see is I feel like we can take out that other exceptions. I don't think that impacts, because what she's talking about is the consequence of it being a Class C felony, but that's not totally what we're talking about. Like the other exceptions can come out. Is anyone else reading that the same way?
You're talking the optional exceptions, Margaret?
Good. Section
Yeah.
4. I'm sorry. What your question before?
Yeah. Yeah.
Margaret,
I think the problem I had with it was more just clarifying what instance would a person want to gain permission from the school to bring a firearm or weapon to, to me, it just, I don't know. It just didn't sit right.
So I had one thought about that, which was just like being in an elementary school, we always have the like yearly officer friendly visits, where they come in and they do bring, I mean, I'm sure it's not loaded, but they bring in some things and they show the kids like they're all dressed up in the garb. So that would be the only thing I could think of that fit that other exception.
And or it could be, I don't know, like a federal officer who's coming to watch their kid's basketball game, and whether they're required to always be armed or whether they just got off work and don't want to leave it locked in their car. I don't know, maybe they're prohibited from leaving it in their vehicles or something.
Right.
I think if there could be exceptions.
So Margaret, I interpreted Rebecca's response a little bit differently in that what she's looking to say, and I'm just going to read it again. She says, Section 4 tracks the legal exceptions to the criminal offense of possession of a weapon on school grounds. So the way that I interpreted that, and based on that A and B, is exactly what Ken is describing, right? I'm there with a deadly weapon or a firearm. And if I am, then there's a reason why I'm there with that, right, legally. And or I have permission to be there. So that's the way that I'm reading that. A little bit different, Joe, than you.
So
like
you're
reading that,
so
like, why would you ever be there with a weapon, right?
Right. So that is kind of different than Section 3, where I guess the key word is his or her official duties. Like when we have the state police audits and we have, they come and they're, they're fully armed and loaded. I don't know.
Look at A. It's saying that if someone was there, it's because they had approval from the school to do so. So A is saying they received approval from the school. And if that's the case, they have written permission prior to being there,
Right.
right? That's A. And then when it comes to B, it's also written agreement between the employer and school official, which is not necessarily a peace officer, right? So the way in which I'm reading that second one is Ken's example. Daddy is an FBI agent, always has to have his or her weapon there. He has written approval in advance. I guess you could say he might be a peace officer too, but he has written permission in advance, and that's why he has that.
Right. And he's not engaged in the performance of his or her official duties.
Right. I'm
So
just
that
there as a
separates
parent.
yep. Okay.
I'm there as a parent. I'm not there. I mean, that's the way I'm interpreting those two.
I guess in either circumstance, the fact that they've got to get that prior written approval from the
Right.
school is the safeguard there, I guess, in a sense.
Yep.
Does this happen? Like,
The only instance I know is just those that I bring in, for either audits, or I've had outside SROs from other cities and towns that came in to look at something to do with our security. So it's kind of a thin line there.
But could it happen is the question, right? I think there's
very
probably some
much so.
examples that we just in this moment can't think about, but I'm sure that there are examples. And I think you're right, Margaret, when you come back to the prior written approval is the key. And I can't think of one at this moment, but having been a building principal, I'm sure that there was times when someone is not in their official duty and is there and has a weapon. Maybe not the written prior approval part, I'm not sure, but
Let me dig into this a little bit. I have some connections, so let me dig into this.
Because it's probably happened. I to your point, Dr. De Silva, I don't think the permission thing maybe has happened as often as maybe it should have, only because if that's your job, it's sort of becomes second nature. And it's just part of you at that point. So.
I know Joe said that he can look into this a little bit further. Do we feel that this is one that could come before the board for a first read? And by that time, Joe would have the information to share with the full board, or do we want to come back to committee further on that piece?
let me just give a ridiculous example for a minute. But let's just say that we were having some type of cultural arts presentation, right? And someone was coming in and they were showing all of their different types of swords that were a part of the history of such and such place, right? It's part of a cultural arts presentation. This is how the swords or knives evolved over time. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but maybe not, actually. Maybe not that much of a stretch. In my mind, when we know that this event is coming, they're going to say, we're going to be bringing in 10 types of swords that were used during the liberation of whatever. And we're bringing them in, and you're getting permission in advance. It's part of their contract, right? We're signing off that they're coming in, that children won't be touching them, but they're going to be displaying these swords. That would be considered a deadly weapon for the purpose of teaching and learning in some type of cultural experience, right? That's, again, a little bit of a stretch right now because I'm thinking on the spot, but that's probably an example that could happen in a program. And why we wouldn't want to necessarily remove those exceptions, because perhaps that's an important part of the cultural arts program that we're engaging in.
Sounds good.
It makes sense. I'm trying to think of the inverse. Are there situations where we wouldn't want to have an exception? But again, I think that written approval piece is part of
you just wouldn't have it, right? You would
Yeah.
say, no, this feels a little too dangerous. They're too young. Kids are going to want to touch, whatever the case may be.
Okay,
I thought of another one,
yeah,
a bad example probably as well, but let's just say Veterans Day, right? Or a veterans celebration. And we were learning about the different types of wars and the different types of ammunition that may have been available or accessible, something like that, right? It's a type of program in the schools. Obviously, these are older weapons. We're not concerned about that. They're not loaded, but yet it's a weapon, right? Could have been deadly.
that's a good example. Okay,
Well, and even a field trip maybe to
I can't hear Ken, we can't hear you again, sorry. Although I don't know that a field trip would be covered under this because it talks about the real property being
Right.
the elementary school, the schools within our district. Okay, so it sounds like, do we feel that this one we could bring before the board for a full discussion, and we would keep in for the other exceptions? And we will not make a change to the prohibitions of deadly weapons. So we'll take it exactly as it is from Shipman without the optional language. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. All right, moving on to, what was the next one? Oh gosh. Yeah, these long-
5141.4, Margaret.
Oh boy, my eyes are spinning after reading these ones. All right, 5141.4, reporting of child abuse, neglect, and sexual assault. So I'll try to, again, summarize where we were from our last session. So at that point, we were using the CABE update to our existing policy and had many, many questions. We wondered if there was a Shipman and Goodwin model policy for clarity of the definitions, as well as consistency with what I'll call the sister policy 5145.511. So after the meeting, I actually did find one. So Shipman and Goodwin just redid their policy web portal. So it's good. It's a lot easier to find things now. But the other thing was this one was filed under the series 4000, which is actually our personnel series. It wasn't filed under 5000, which our number is 5141.4. But that was very enlightening because I think it was Susie who in our last meeting mentioned that this policy only pertains to employees and their requirements to report. So it makes sense that it was in Shipman's 4000 series, and it also helps to clarify that question for us. So then there are also updated regulations for the administration from Shipman and Goodwin that the administration can take a look at. As we know, the board doesn't approve regulations, just policies. Some of the questions. So anyway, so I did find the Shipman model policy. That's what's included in your packet. That's the one we're going to look at because I do think it answered a lot of our questions. Some of which were clarity of the definitions, especially around assault and abuse. Why was there a distinction in terms of the types of reporting that needed to happen and how it happened? Another question was, does this cover a contractor who's working directly with students? Because it talked about employees, but not necessarily those what that meant. And then does the location of the abuse matter? So those were a few of the questions that came up in our last discussion. As I looked through Shipman's model policy, I do believe many of those questions were answered. Again, the clarity is that this policy deals with employees' requirements to report. It talks about the statutory requirements, which are different if it's a child under the age of 18 and it involves abuse and neglect, not sexual assault, because sexual assault is covered under policy 5145.511, which we're also looking at. But it also talks about people who are educated by the technical education and career system. That one does cover sexual abuse, and the perpetrator must be a school employee. In addition, the Shipman model policy goes beyond that statutory requirement. And as you'll see at the last part of paragraph 1, and requires all employees of the Board of Education to report abuse, neglect, non-accidental physical injury, risk of serious harm, or sexual assault of any student by a school employee. So the Shipman policy goes beyond even the statutory benchmark. Anyway, that was a lot.
Margaret, the two small pieces that I added was the language may versus shall,
Yep.
and written in some cases versus oral.
So I think the may versus shall was actually in the 5145.511, right? Was that,
It was, yes.
or was it in both?
Hang on, I thought it was in,
Maybe it is in both.
let me just double check.
It's in the 1212 also. Something else.
Oh, yes, right. Yeah, you're right. I know for sure it was in the
It's definitely in 5145.511. It's definitely in that one.
Yeah. Yeah, it was definitely in that
And
one.
it's also in 5141.4. It's used, well, it's in the red line. It's used interchangeably. So there's times in which it says shall and other times in which it says may.
Oh, right.
So for example, on that first page, the last two paragraphs, I believe it says may.
Right.
And then the paragraph prior, I think it says shall. I don't remember where, but oh yeah, a mandated report shall make an oral report.
Right.
And
That's on the red line.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I
Well-
think the red line is the one we ditched because that was the old model. So we're now just working off of Shipman's model, which is not.
Oh, right. So hang on, let me just take a look at that one.
I know it was confusing.
So in theirs, we're just working off of theirs. Their language is
I didn't see may in that one.
Yeah, their language is, do you see that one, Nora? Their language is much stronger. So
Yeah, I
Yeah,
saw a lot of must.
there's musts. Yeah. So my preference is for the stronger language.
Agreed. So I don't know if people had specific questions on this one. I mean, again, as far as I read it, it's about the employees, district employees, requirement to report. It also covers under employees. I think it includes contractors as well. So that was a question. And specifically even, what is it, section 9 talks about, oh no, that's if the perpetrator is a school employee. Sorry, it was section 9. And it talks about, so again, the under 18, the standard as required by the legislature is about the requirement to report suspected abuse or neglect. And the perpetrator does not have to be an employee if there's suspected, right? Versus in that second part of the legislation, again, if it's someone who's being educated by the technical education and career system, an employee must report it if it's an assault and the perpetrator is an employee. So there's a lot of like little distinctions in that first paragraph on the reporting. Am I reading that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't know if there were any specific questions on this.
I felt much more comfortable with this one than the other one.
Yeah, and the way it ties with the other one is, it's all clear.
It's really clear. Yep. The definitions and the scope, everything's really clear.
The one thing I didn't see in here, because I tried to map out, okay, if I'm an employee and I'm reporting, or if the perpetrator is an employee or not an employee, I don't know if there's a gap, but maybe there isn't. So if 5141.4 talks about employees having to report. And then 5145.511 is about sexual abuse and assault for those under 18. And that includes like parents can report, adults need to report, students report, right? But what I didn't see is what happens if there's abuse and neglect suspected, and it's a parent or another adult who's not a school employee. Is that a gap here? And I think
It's not a gap in, let me review the policy again. It's not a gap in operations for
Right.
us.
right.
Um,
Where I thought it might not be a gap. So it felt like as I read everything, I was like, oh gosh, that feels like a gap. But then I thought through the process, and probably where from a practice standpoint, it isn't. And I think actually, if you follow the logic of the policies as well, it isn't, is that if I'm an adult, if I'm a parent and I suspect that an employee of the district is the perpetrator of the abuse or neglect on a student, I'm going to report that to the school, like the principal, the teacher, or the superintendent, whomever it is. And then that person now is an employee. And as an employee, they're required under 5141.4 now to report that. Does that make?
well, so 5141.4 requires that you report that, but just bring me back to your logic just from the start.
If I'm a parent and
Yeah.
I'm suspecting abuse or neglect by an employee of the district who's the perpetrator,
Mhm.
it's abuse and neglect. So it's not covered under 0.511 because that's only sexual assault. So what policy, or if I'm a parent, how does that abuse and neglect get taken care of?
So if I'm a parent and I suspect abuse and neglect, I'm either going to call the Department of Children and Families myself, or I'm going to report it to a mandated reporter,
Right.
right? So I'm going to call the school, principal, teacher, para, anyone in that school basically, and say, I think my child has been abused by X, Y, or Z.
Right.
And quite frankly, it doesn't matter if that parent says their child, or they suspect a child, their child, any child is abused by someone from the school or someone outside of the school. The moment that individual tells someone from the school, we're now mandated reporters.
Right. So that's where I think
be a mandated reporter too. Like, right, the person that told me might be a mandated reporter, but it doesn't matter. I'm still a mandated reporter, so I'm still going to report.
Right. So that's why there isn't a gap, I guess, because someone would be bringing it to an employee of the district who has to report it. A parent, if I had that. It only felt like a gap, I guess, because in the 0.511 policy, it specifically talks about if you're a parent, this is what you do. If you're a student, this is what you do. It doesn't specifically say that in 5141.4. It doesn't specifically say go to a school personnel and report it, and then they are now covered under mandatory reporting of 5141.4. Does that make sense? It's a lot.
Yeah, the only gap that I could see is that if someone suspects abuse or neglect and doesn't tell a school
Right.
person, we just don't know.
Right, and then we wouldn't know.
Outside of that, any type of, any definition that's on 5141.4 or 5145.5, by any definition there, the moment we're told, we report.
You have to report it. Okay.
We don't investigate it, we report it.
Right. Okay.
I mean, we may do some investigation, but ultimately it's still our job just to report. It's our job not just to report, to report.
And that would be report and then investigate if we thought so, or would we investigate the validity of the report? How would that work?
So ultimately, our job is when there's a report of abuse or neglect, we're going to make that report to DCF and allow them to investigate it. Karen can speak about the investigation that may happen internally for other reasons, but when we suspect, we lean on other folks that are trained in that way to do a full and comprehensive investigation and give everybody the due process that they deserve as well. And as will be Karen.
Sure. So as Susie said, first we report to DCF. Depending upon what the allegation is, there also could be a report to the police. But if it's something that we don't think is a criminal matter, but that could still be an employment matter, we cannot interfere with a DCF investigation. So in my experience, what we've done is we've made the report to DCF. We place the person on administrative leave with pay without prejudice while that investigation goes on. Once that is concluded, then it comes to us. So there's times where if DCF says it's not a DCF matter and they find there's no reason to move forward, it still could be an employment matter. So we definitely make sure that we do not interfere with their investigation, but then we'll conduct our own. Any other questions about that I could elaborate on?
I think we're good, Karen.
I know it's a long policy. There's a lot in here. I mean, a lot specifically, for the administration to take a look and make sure that these are things that I'm assuming you're doing already. And as Karen just alluded to.
Operationally, absolutely.
Operationally, yeah.
Yep.
So it feels like a lot of that, as long as operationally you're okay with how that all, I didn't have any comments other than the ones that I just shared. I don't know if anyone else on the board does. Is 5141.4 then the shipment model? Is that one that we're ready to bring before the full board? Okay. Great. All right, and then I know we kind of already talked a little bit about the 0.511. This was again.
I'm sorry, Margaret.
So yeah.
I did have a question about it.
Oh,
so is it, no, I just thought of it as you were moving on. Are we good with the placement of it in the 5,000 series versus under personnel?
Thank you. I had that question too. I forgot. This is interesting. This is not the first policy where Shipman has it in a different place than CABE does. From a
CABE
clarity,
had it in the, no, Shipman has it in the 4,000s, right?
right, which would be personnel, which makes sense because it's about an employee's requirements, right? But I think that CABE has it in the 5,000 series, which is students, because it's about something happening to a student. So it could go either place. I know it's odd, right?
If I get a vote, I say students.
I could see it in both.
I could see it in both, right? Yeah. I don't know, Karen, I don't know if you have any experience where, like I said, I know that this has happened before with Shipman and CABE policies, but I don't know how we resolve.
Yeah. Although I respect Ken's vote, my immediate reaction was personnel, only because it's the obligation of the employee. And if there's anything about informing employees of their obligation, that's where I would go first. Obviously, it's to protect students, so I don't want to minimize the impact on students about this.
The great, thank you, Ken, for reminding us on that question. I wonder if we should, because I don't know what number it would be assigned to if it goes into the 4,000s, because we follow the CABE. CABE does host we can do some investigation into that, but at the very least, perhaps there's also a way, if it's put into the 4,000s, that we can have some reference in the 5,000s to it, or, I mean, there is by nature of it being in the 0.511, which keeps cross-referencing it, if nothing else, it's there, but.
And for the record, I defer to Karen's expertise on this. So.
We have the ultimate same outcome or goal. Yeah.
Okay. That's a good question. We'll follow up on that.
So I think what we're saying, Margaret, is that possibly put it in the 4,000 series, since that's who's hosting our CABE policies, and then make reference to it in the 5,000, make reference in the 5,000s, make reference to the 4,000, right?
Correct. Yeah. Okay. Yep. I think that would be my vote. Following up on Karen. All right, good. Great. Thank you. Thanks, Ken. So the next one, which was, again, we've kind of talked about a little bit, references, the one that we just talked about is the 5145.511. So this was the one that had the questions about the may and shall. It also had, I think, Susie, you also had the questions about, like, for parents and adults, they could do written reports, but students could do written or verbal reports.
So Rebecca didn't get back to me on that, but I thought I noticed something different with the Shipman. Am I correct in saying in the Shipman, the word must is used?
So what's interesting is this is also a Shipman model policy. This was also a Shipman policy, and this one we just adopted, a short time ago. So it's the must is in the employees' requirements. This is the may as it relates to, and maybe because we can't force a parent or an adult to file a written report. We're just saying they can if they know about it. Or may.
So Rebecca didn't opine on this one yet. She said she'd get back to me, but so my question was whether or not we could be stronger by saying shall. When I reread it, the language makes me think that it's if a child prefers or a student prefers to just make the verbal report, they have the option just to make the verbal report. Whereas I think it was an adult or it was the school employee that had to, right? That shall. A school, yeah. So in D, it says a school employee.
Yep.
No, actually it's the last policy that I think I read that where they shall.
It is actually in D on this one, and what it does is it references the last policy.
Okay.
So which makes sense because it's a mandated reporting situation. So the shall would make sense.
So they have, right, there's no alternative, but I think you're right, Margaret, in that C allows if a student goes and doesn't make a written report, but just goes and tells somebody, any school employee, that this happened to him or her, we're not going to obligate him to go then create a written report. Right. We have our report and we take notes and then move forward from there.
Yep.
So I think it's okay with the Shipman the way it's written.
Okay. I agree with that. Does anyone else have any other questions on this one?
Except in B, this is where, okay, any adult affiliated with the school community may file. Here's another may that I'm not comfortable with.
Right, because they're affiliated with the school community.
Yeah.
I think that goes to Margaret's point of what is that adult affiliation? Like, we can't force a parent volunteer to do something. We can suggest they do it. We can implore that they do it. We can give them all of the mechanisms they need to do it. But at the end of the day, we don't really have control over them like we would an employee or a contractor or somebody else we engaged.
So the reason I question this one, I agree with you, Ken. But because it's affiliated, like, to me, that language feels like they're connected. They're a school volunteer. They're a school community member that comes in every Friday and reads to the kids. It's connected to the school. So the language of affiliated.
Yeah, that might be the trick, because technically a parent of a child in our district is an affiliated person.
Right. So A, I agree with you. On A, there, the may works because it's a parent or guardian. But at the B one, I feel like at that, I guess you could argue it your way too. You could say a parent is affiliated with the school, but not a school employee or not a volunteer, I guess.
Right. I think the trick is with the affiliated. What is an affiliated and adult? Like how are we defining that?
Yeah.
Separately from, a parent or guardian, and separate from an actual employee of the school or a contractor, et cetera.
I don't know. To me, employees are mandated reporters. So I think that, anything there about saying affiliated, if you're not an employee, we follow the definition of who's a mandated reporter under Connecticut law. And I don't think outside of that population, we have any ability to require somebody to do something.
So then, Karen, you're defining any adult affiliated could just be a parent, not just a parent, but it could be a parent rather than
Right.
a volunteer and so forth. So therefore, you can't force them to.
That's how I'm interpreting it, because otherwise state statute defines who is a mandated reporter.
Okay.
Tina?
So the way I'm reading, right, the A says parents or guardian of a student, but then you say an adult. I was thinking if we have adults and if we have parent volunteers, they are covered under A, aren't they? Like, if I'm a PTA volunteer, I go in, I'm only doing this because I am a parent of a child in a school. Any adult could be, I'm trying to think, when we have PTA events and we have people who are not part of the PTAs come in. So they're volunteering, yes, but they're not parents of an RPS child, but they're an adult who are associated by virtue of a PTA event, I would say. Wouldn't that be that? So we can't really force them to report. They may observe a sexual assault, but we can't really mandate them. I guess I'm getting what the difference is. How do we make this, or can we make this shall?
I don't think we have the legal
No, we
ability
don't.
to make it shall.
I'm with you.
What if we said, what if we made it like there's two options, like they can file a written or oral report, so that means, implies they have to do one or the other. I mean, I use it with my toddler,
I'm wondering, to Ken's point, I'm wondering if somewhere else in our regulations, we require volunteers to report to us. We're the mandated reporters. So we don't have to require them to file the report with DCAB, but we have to say, if you are on our property and you witness something as a volunteer, you must report to us. Could that be a way to get around this?
That's a good.
Does it not say in policy 1212 when you talk about volunteers?
That's what I'm wondering when we go to that.
And other non-employees working within the schools must work under the supervision or in close proximity to Richfield Publics. They're held to the same standards of conduct as school staff and must observe all board policies, including applicable policies and the confidentiality. So could we not add it there?
So I actually think that that's already assumed, right? So they have to follow whatever policies we have in place. So therefore,
It's covered.
I don't think they have to report something.
No, it doesn't, right? That's the thing. That's a difference. They're working under the supervision, but it doesn't talk about reporting abuse or sexual assault. Because we do talk about the fact that we can't have volunteers who are registered as sex offenders. So I'm still new to this, so I'm sorry. I'm trying to understand how policies link to all other policies. There's a lot. So I'm just trying to understand, can this somehow link to this to make it clear?
It seems to me that we really can't force beyond a may, because we can't say they have to. I mean, it is up to them. So it seems like the may is kind of a reality.
You're right.
I think I feel that way too. And there was, Ken, I know you mentioned, may, and then should we put in the option of oral or written? And I think there I might have a concern because I have a feeling that the written piece is actually part of what's required from a legal standpoint. Students, I can see why they might be able to do something orally, but I would think any adult, you'd want something in writing for,
Well,
I don't know.
to be fair, I'd want it any way that I could get it.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody doesn't want to, that just, I observed this happening and I don't want to get involved, but I just thought you should know. I'm not, I'm going to thank them for doing that and not say, well, you got to write a written report or I can't do anything. So I don't know. And it's probably semantics at some point, because again, to the point everyone's making, once a mandated reporter knows, no matter how they received it. So we could be talking, what we're saying now is moot anyway.
Yeah.
To a degree.
And I think, like, as I read further in section B and stuff, part of the reason for the written requirement is because that gets forwarded to the safe school climate person for review. So that's why the written piece is included in there, because the whole reason for this policy is because of that safe school climate legislation, I believe. So it's and I hear you. I absolutely hear you. I mean, obviously we want it however we can get it, but I think there's some meat behind the fact that it says written. That has to do with some of the legislation. Well, we can ask. We can certainly ask.
That's still on my list. So if it's all right with the committee, we can table this one until I can get those 2 questions answered from Rebecca.
Can I ask, do we want to, because 0.4 and 0.511 are so intertwined, do we want to hold them off to bring them to the board at the same time? So if we're going to be holding off on 0.511, that we also hold off on 0.4?
I agree.
I think that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. Anything more on either one of those? All right. We've got about 8 minutes left. I mean, like I said at the beginning, it was an aggressive timeline. What we can do, I can just introduce this next series. So like the 0.4 and the 0.511, 1212 and 4122 kind of need to be considered together. These came to us because in the December 2020 Shipman and Goodwin updates, they spoke about the need to remove interns from the policy concerning student teachers in the certified section of the policy book. So that what had been in 4122, and put interns under the community relations and volunteers section, which is 1212. But again, these 2 policies interplay, so we have to consider them together. Then we also have to make sure that in 4122, we have the appropriate language regarding student teachers and some of that background check information. So again, just briefly, in terms of 1212, which is the volunteers, something to remember on this one is we actually right now, 1212 exists in our COVID policy packet, which, as we know, takes precedence over any of the underlying policies until June 30th, at which point that sunsets and we go back to whatever the underlying policy is. So some of this is us getting this one up to date and in place for when the COVID policies sunset on June 30th. It's good to note that in that COVID policy, it actually already is the language that's in this proposed language, not actually what we had in our old policy, which was more modeled on a CABE version. Are you guys following me on that? So anyway, so the 1212 policy, as Shipman has updated it, is clarifying that student interns do not include student teachers. Student teachers are individuals enrolled in a teacher preparation program in accordance with Connecticut General Statute 1010A and are not considered volunteers under the policy because they're subject to specific background check requirements under Connecticut law. Background checks for student teachers are addressed in the policy concerning employment and student teacher checks, which is 4112.51. And I'm sure Karen could even speak to that one. I think we recently redid that one. So again, that's why that's coming to us. And 4112.51 that has the background check stuff is a shipment policy. So again, they all kind of tie together. Do we, again, in our last 5 minutes, I don't know if there are any specific questions anybody had on any of these, if we want to dig in a little bit, or if there's any big questions, if Susie's going to be going back to the attorneys about our last policies, if we want her to be asking any questions on either one of these two.
So I'm going to ask Karen a question that she probably won't be able to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Karen, given the fact that our student interns often become our student teachers, why do you think they removed interns from the policy?
Susie, I had actually the same question. Fortunately, in Ridgefield, we don't do what many districts do, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is where we hire a year-long intern and then have that person during that year do student teaching.
Right.
So we do have interns from one university. That's all they do for us. They don't do student teaching as part of that internship. But that is very common for most of the local universities. So I wondered why they separated it out, because it's also part of their approved planned program of study.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There
so
are
this
many interns that have to do some hours that are not that same that you're familiar with.
Right. So by policy, this would make perfect sense in this community, the way that we are designing our student interns, but in every other community that I've ever worked in, it wouldn't have.
It's at odds. Yes, yeah. I agree with you.
Because the student interns, so in the model that we use in Ridgefield, it's different, but in the model in most districts, those student interns come, they serve basically as a substitute in many classrooms over the course of a year, and then do their student teaching in that same community, and they go to finding a job. So the transition between the internship and the student teaching is quite frankly seamless and not separate. So it's interesting to me that they elected, because we don't do anything differently when they become the student teacher outside of they're paid differently through the intern programs. So we basically take on their tuition. In most of these programs, you take on their tuition and they sub at no cost, with the exception of that student teaching experience. But there really isn't there's nothing that distinguishes the transition from internship to student teacher. And I'm seeing Laura shake her head, because that's the traditional model that you might see. Obviously, we do it a little bit differently here. So I think,
but it's still a commitment by the district for a year for that same individual. So you're right.
Right. You're right. So I think I'd want to know more why we're taking that population out. Or are they defining the student intern differently? Maybe the way that our interns.
So Susie, I wonder that, because in other disciplines, say psychology, counseling, and so also in teacher education, there are times where at the beginning of your teacher prep program or your clinical study program that require internship hours, and they're more limited. They're 20 hours, they're 4 weeks, they're short-term opportunities to come in and observe. So we do sometimes have those and have a process for that. And we do treat them differently than student teaching, because they're not in a formal, well, I shouldn't say they're in a formal program, but they're not doing that formal program of student teaching. It's just in one class required some types of hours in a school district. So it could be the terminology intern or internship.
It also felt to me like what they were doing was trying to carve out. So if 4122, which was about student teachers, related to the background check requirement, I think what they were trying to do was to give a little bit of flexibility for the idea of an intern not to have to subject to that same background check. So maybe that's what they did. And in so doing, they made too big of a carve out. it seems.
Yeah, that's a good point, Margaret, because a true intern would always be in the same room with the classroom teacher. They should never be alone with students. But obviously the point of student teaching is to do that, transitional, where you're now going to assume full responsibility of the classroom and you could be alone with the students. So that could be the defining factor for the background check.
And the student intern that I'm defining with the language that I used would almost never have the teacher in the classroom with them, because they often have a degree from another field and they're now studying to be educators. And so therefore they're covering a classroom just like any other substitute we might have.
Mm-hmm.
So I can follow up on that question as well if the committee is comfortable with that.
Yeah, sounds like that would be good to get clarification. We certainly don't want to hamstring something that we're doing from a practice standpoint if it's working well. Okay. Wow. 7 o'clock on my. So it sounds like, so we are moving policy 1700 to the board, the full board, for a first read. And I think we had 2 policies from the last meeting that we'll do as well. So there should be 3. We will not be moving 5141.4, although we feel like we're in a decent place with that one. We're not going to move that forward because we have the outstanding question on the sister policy of 5145.511. And then Dr. De Silva will also do some further follow-up on the 1212 and 4122 to get some more understanding behind that and those changes.
Yeah.
Great.
Margaret, I actually have a question that's off agenda.
Yeah.
But just in terms of, have you heard anything around policies related to committee meetings? I don't think this will be the case for board meetings because of public comment, but committee meetings and those being able to, or just can they be virtual outside of COVID?
Oh. I'll have to go back and look at my notes on that one. I think that question has come up.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, obviously with board meetings, public comment's a little bit different and I haven't heard about that, but I'm just curious about committee meetings and what the future will look like.
Yeah, I'll go back and take a look. I think there was some discussion, but as you know, things change too. So what might have been true 4 months ago might not even necessarily be the case now. I'll ask that question. That's a really good one.
Okay.
All right. That's it. And I think in our next policy meeting, we'll obviously come back with some of this stuff, but I think if I can also ask committee members, if you could go and take a look at that COVID policy packet at some point over the next month, just to kind of see, because again, that will sunset on the 30th. So I want to make sure that if there's any underlying policies that we're going back to that should be changed or updated, again, I think we mentioned specifically, we probably should adopt that green cleaning policy. Stuff like that I'm trying to track, but it would be great to have second sets of eyes on that as well, on things that we might want to make sure that we implement beyond the 30th.
So Margaret, related to that,
Mm-hmm.
I did have a recent question. Yeah. So the board policy around the Family First Coronavirus Response Act did have a expiration date of December 31st.
Oh.
So I am assuming that the Executive Order 10 from Governor Lamont supersedes that now, and we don't need the policy, but it was just something that I came across that I wondered how that intersected with the policy that had an expiration date before June 30th.
Dr. De Silva, maybe do you want to add that to your list for the attorneys? Because I know that the COVID policy packet came directly from them and there was a specific reason on that December 31st. So I think you bring up a good point, Karen, and it's probably one of those things where, right, it might be covered under executive, but from a clarity standpoint, might be good to even just extend it to whenever. Great point. All right. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Ken, do I have a second? Tina, all in favor, please raise your hand. Oh, it's unanimous. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.